Welcome to the International Conference on Children and their Family using the mixed data, Day 2 in Room 1. So I'm Stephanie Kauv, and I'll be chairing today's session on Inequality, Children in Poverty and Social Protection, session number 2. So my co-chair today is Dr. Enrique Delamonica III, Senior Advisor Statistics and Monitoring on Child Poverty and Gender Equality. So before I introduce our speakers, a few words on housekeeping. This session will be recorded and hosted on the UNICEF Mix website and YouTube channel, as well as on the BPI YouTube channel and embedded on the BPI website after the event. By attending, your consent to be part of this recording. For those present online, please ensure that you have added your name rather than being listed as guest, as the team will be monitoring attendees, and we also need to know who is asking our speakers questions. You will be able to ask questions in person or via Zoom, the QA function, which is in the bottom of the screen. Due to time constraints, we may not be able to answer every question, but for sessions in Bristol, please feel free to get in touch with the speakers after the session to continue the conversation. Just to let you know, we will prioritize questions that are in the room first, and if there is remaining time, then we can take questions. But don't hesitate to put your question in this Q&A. If you have several or multiple questions, please put them in multiple messages in the Q&A section. I will remind you to please be respectful. All events at this conference are being monitored, and we reserve the right to remove attendees whose comments are deemed offensive and derogatory. So today we have 4 sessions. One that will be introduced by Sara Rotenberg on health insurance among children with disabilities, evidence from 34 mixed data. The second one will be introduced by Mary Zhang, I believe, on cluster analysis of multidimensional poverty in Africa. Oh yeah, just to let you know, this is a hybrid session today. Improving the measurement of the mix of social material deprivation for children and their families by Dave Gordon. And the last session by Oliver Fiala on social protection, child poverty and resilience. So, starting with Sara Rotenberg on the first session on health insurance among children with disabilities. You have 40 minutes.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Sara Rotenberg. I'm a research fellow at the International Center for Evidence and Disability at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And today I'll be presenting on health insurance for children with disabilities. So we're very grateful at the center to be part of the PENDA program, which is building evidence on what works for children with disabilities, funded by the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office. And so why have we looked at disability and why is our center focused on it? It's because it's 16% of the world's population, which is 1.6 billion people. And a recent UNICEF report estimated that's about 10% of children. So there are 240 million children in the world who live with disabilities. And we know from our analyses in the mix that children with disabilities often have worse health status and outcomes. They're much more likely to be stunted, wasted, or underweight, or have common diseases that are the leading causes of childhood mortality. And then we've also shown that across the mix, children with disabilities have worse social determinants of health. So they're more likely to be overage for grade, be out of school, have fewer opportunities to play, have a lower childhood development index, and experience violent discipline and child labor. And so all of these things contribute to much worse health outcomes and make having health insurance quite a priority. And if you look at sort of the data on people with disabilities globally, what you see is that there are various barriers in trying to access healthcare systems. So when you speak to people with disabilities, they report they're 4 times more likely to be treated badly, they're 3 times more likely to be denied healthcare, and they're 50% more likely to have catastrophic health expenditures. So those barriers in actually trying to access care also are exacerbated by poor quality of care, so a lack of training for healthcare professionals or inaccessible health facilities. So even if you need to have healthcare, you often can't get there because there's no transport Or you go to a clinic and if you're deaf, you can't actually communicate with the health provider. And so what we see is that these barriers that we know from qualitative research, from quantitative research, actually result in much worse health outcomes. I shared briefly what it is for children, but what this is we've just done a big study showing that it results in a 2.4 times higher mortality rate, much higher rates of NCDs, HIV, serious illness, and COVID mortality. And when we put this higher mortality into a population model, what we found is that leads to a 14-year difference in life expectancy. And this is amongst all people with disabilities. So it's a component maybe due to the underlying impairment, but largely this is because of the systemic barriers I've discussed. And so that's why we have really enjoyed working with the mix for the last 4 years, is because it's been a wonderful source of data on people with disabilities and trying to motivate action to make health systems better for this population. So one of the analyses we've done within this is health insurance, and so trying to look at how children with disabilities have been included in these programs. And so we've used the mixed definition of the percent of the population covered by health insurance, which is sort of one of the tracer indicators and central to the target of achieving universal health insurance. And as I mentioned earlier, because people with disabilities are much more likely to experience catastrophic health expenditures, this is crucial, and we have almost no data on health insurance coverage, so this is a wonderful opportunity. And so Mix 6 has included something called the Child Functioning Module, which you may be familiar with, and this was developed by UNICEF and the Washington Group, which is the Washington Group on Disability Statistics. And so they measure disability differently across the different age groups in the mix, but generally it includes vision, hearing, communication, controlling behavior, and learning. So it asks caregivers of children what is the child's level of difficulty in each of these domains. And then for children 2 to 4, it has some more questions about playing and dexterity, because those are much more relevant. And then for children 5 to 17, it also includes things about remembering, concentrating, self-care, accepting change, making friends, and then affect, so anxiety and depression. And in round 6, there's currently about 40 countries that have this disability data, and children are considered to be disabled if their caregiver has answered a lot of difficulty or cannot do at all out of the 4 questions. That's how we've defined it. And so also, as part of our methods, just before going on to the results, at the school, we've developed a R package called Data Description that harmonizes data from all the multiple indicator cluster surveys. And so we have embarked on this over the last 4 years, trying to see how you can combine data and create one large data set to look at differences between countries. And so I'd be happy to speak with people who are interested in that, but we also have built out the functions so that it's fairly easy for people to just complete analyses and for exposures for different groups. So we predominantly look at children with disabilities, but you could do it for gender, socioeconomic status, or other factors. And so we use this package to make one large data set for 34 Mix 6 countries. And as I said, we define disability as anyone who has a lot of difficulty or cannot do it all. And then anyone who reported any form of health insurance. So if that was employer-based or state-based. And then we controlled for age, sex, and country for when we did any pooled estimates. Any children who didn't have a completed child functioning module, so we couldn't assess their disability status, was excluded, and anyone with fewer than 25 respondents with disabilities, because the numbers are just too small. And then we use modified Poisson regressions to estimate risk ratios. And so this method allows us to combine data for about 350,000 children, including 73,000 children with disabilities. We found that there was an overall prevalence of health insurance for 18%, but this varied substantially, so it was about 2% in low-income countries and about 50% in high-income countries. And overall, the difference was about slightly higher, so 19% for children without disabilities and 13% for children with disabilities. And our pooled results showed that children with disabilities were slightly less likely to have health insurance, but this varied substantially by country income level. So lower middle income countries, there was a substantial difference for children with disabilities. But then when we looked at it by countries that had sort of overall greater health insurance coverage, so if we looked at Ghana and Dominican Republic, so about 60% of those countries have some form of health insurance coverage. That's where we saw the difference for children with disabilities, so they were significantly less likely to be covered by any form of health insurance. And then we looked at it also, it's really important to understand the differences in a huge data set like this, if there are differences for specific children with disabilities. And so we didn't see anything by gender, so girls and boys were equally likely to have health insurance, but when we looked at it by location, children with disabilities in rural areas were significantly more likely to not have health insurance, and so this is a big gap. And then also those from the poorest 40% of households were significantly less likely to have health insurance, particularly in low-income countries. And so what we have sort of taken away from this is that it's consistent with the other literature that says that people with disabilities experience catastrophic health expenditure, that they have barriers in accessing health insurance, that it can sometimes be in a system where it's employment-based, and because we know that people with disabilities are less likely to be employed, this could be a reason for why they might not have it. But there are some key questions, especially when you look at data from such a wide array of sources of, does it include disability-specific services? So even if we're saying that people with disabilities might have the same level of health insurance coverage, what does that package include? Does it include things like, speech therapy, physiotherapy, more frequent health checkups, those types of things? And so is it actually, is coverage the right metric here, I think is what this is getting at. And so what would actually be equitable for children with disabilities, right? We might actually want to see higher rates of coverage because a health system might be able to provide all the necessary services and health services for someone with a disability, but they may need extra services that aren't covered. So for instance, I'm from Canada, and their physiotherapy, ophthalmology services are not covered. So those, and people with disabilities are more likely to need those sort of allied health services. And then another key question that isn't really captured in this big analysis, but is also important to explore, is what the health system has and how health systems may differ to provide different things. And so we have to think about, especially as there's sort of action to reduce inequalities in health insurance coverage and achieve universal health coverage, I think there's an opportunity to really think about disability inclusion within that. And so thinking about what we can improve sort of for all health systems. And then finally, I think some of the statistics show that people with disabilities have a worse quality of health care. So even if they're fully covered, what is the care they actually receive? So health insurance alone isn't going to solve all the barriers I listed, but if you couple it with health systems reforms like health worker training or improving the physical accessibility of facilities, you'll likely have a much better approach to improving health systems for people with disabilities. And so just to conclude, what we've shown here is that children with disabilities have greater health needs but less access to health insurance, and this is particularly important for those in low-income countries, rural areas, and from the poorest 40% of households. But I think further refinements in sort of the type of health system and what is covered by each health insurance package is needed to sort of understand how these differences play out for children with disabilities around the world. So with that, I'll end there, but thank you so much, and thanks to the mixed team for this great conference.
So now we are going to move on to a new presentation, which is called Cluster Analysis of Multidimensional Poverty in Africa from Zhang.
Great, fantastic. Thanks so much. Okay, so in today's presentation, I'm going to share with you our work on cluster analysis of multidimensional poverty in Africa using the mixed data. This is a joint work with my colleagues from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden and the University of Bristol in the UK. Several reasons motivate this work. To support just the transferring to an equitable, sustainable, and flourishing future, it is critical to mitigate the disproportionate impacts of extreme events, such as the COVID-19 pandemic or climate change, on those already poor and vulnerable. Poor individuals and households lack the resources, information, and facilities to buffer the global challenges. They are severely underrepresented in decision-making, facing high risks of financial or job losses. Professor Peter Townsend in 1979 came up with one of the most influential definitions of poverty and deprivation. According to his relative deprivation theory, poverty refers to situations where individuals, families, and groups in a population are deprived of the resources which are believed to be necessary in the society to which they belong. The advantage of defining and measuring poverty and deprivation relative to the societal environments where people live is that it addresses the criticisms of some other commonly used poverty measures, which usually overlook local knowledge, experiences, and preferences, and replace them with universal metrics of value driven by the market. Our study focused on 8 aspects that reflect a household's inadequate living space and a lack of necessary items for a basic standard of living. The first 3 indicators reflect the household's living conditions. For instance, whether the household is shared by 6 or over 6 household members, whether 3 or more than 3 household members need to share a single sleeping room, and whether the household is a mixed generation one that people over 60 have to live with 3 or over 3 younger household members whose age was between 5 to 50. The remaining 5 indicators reflect the lack of fundamental household items, including soup for hand washing, refrigerators for food preservation, safe drinking water, and cooking facilities, as well as the fact that the household needs to share toilet facilities with other households. All those deprivation indicators are measured and harmonized across countries. We use each country's most updated mixed data when we produce this analysis, with the awareness that some countries collected more recent mixed data. Wherever mixed data was unavailable for the country, we harmonized data from the Demographic and Household Survey Program as an alternative data source. In total, over 300,000 households were included in our analysis. We aggregated the data by each country for the cluster analysis, with the total country number as 48. Whenever one variable is missing, data are imputed using a linear regression. The data imputation was performed at the country level. This page shows the descriptive statistics of the 8 deprivation indicators across the 48 countries. By just eyeballing this graph, we can see huge variations between countries. We conducted a hierarchical cluster analysis using Wolf's methods with a squared Euclidean distance matrix. Wolf's method is arguably one of the most appropriate agglomerative approaches for combining clusters. It argues that the distance between two clusters A and B is the extent to which the sum of squares increases when merging the two clusters. The sum of squares starts from 0. The sum of squares starts from 0, where each country is in its own cluster and grows as we merge the countries. Wolf's method keeps this growth as small as possible and gives a hint during the merging process at which a reasonable number of clusters should be chosen. Our data identified 5 clusters of countries, which are also plotted on the right side map based on their cluster numbers. Countries with the same cluster number are in the same color. The first cluster contains countries located across or above the northern tropic, and those across or below the southern tropic. The second cluster contains most countries between the equator and the southern tropic. The third cluster contains most countries between the equator and the southern tropic, as well as Madagascar. Countries in Cluster 4 are mostly Western African countries, especially those near the coast. The final cluster includes countries from the north to the south, including Ghana, the Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, and so on. The clusters generally match the socio-economic development patterns of the countries, although we believe that economic factors are not the only drivers. We focused on 8 deprivation indicators, all dichotomized, with 1 indicating the presence of deprivation and 0 indicating the absence of deprivation. Therefore, there are 256 possible configurations of those 8 indicators. We listed the top 5 configurations here to illustrate our point further. At a household level, the most common configuration is the lack of all 5 household items and facilities. Approximately 7.5% households in our data fall into this category. The second most common configuration reflects the positive progress of the African continent in combating poverty. Approximately 6% of households in our data had adequate living space and necessary items and resources. The third and fourth common configurations is the lack of 4 out of the 5 household items. The fifth common configuration is a lack of the 5 household items combined with insufficient living space that 6 or over 6 household members need to share a single property. Now we turn to the most common configuration in each country. In countries such as Algeria, South Africa, and so on, the most common configuration is that households had no deprivation on any of the 8 indicators. Most countries belong to the first cluster in the cluster analysis. For countries where the most common configuration is the deprivation on every indicator, most countries belong to the second cluster in the cluster analysis. So this checking can cross-validate the cluster analysis findings. What conclusions can we draw from this set of analyses? First, positive progress has been made in African countries combating poverty and deprivation. This is evident because a noticeable number of households had adequate living conditions and items. Still, many households and individuals lack those necessities, making them vulnerable to life challenges such as the pandemic or climate change. Second, we noticed from the common configurations of these deprivation indicators that several poverty aspects co-occur more often than others. For example, a lack of toilet facilities is usually associated with a lack of cooking facilities or safe drinking water. This can provide policymakers with useful evidence to estimate the severity of deprivation and allocate resources effectively to those in need. On the other hand, despite the configurations of poverty indicators differing among countries, the essential idea about poverty and deprivation, that is, a lack of customary resources, is shared across countries. The significant implications for policymakers and international organizations are that merely increasing income is not enough to enhance people's quality of life, especially for those who lack access to basic service and living conditions and items. Finally, we hope to use this study to illustrate how mixed data can provide a solid foundation for innovative and advanced quantitative analysis by revealing individual or household level variations in people's living conditions and enabling meaningful cross-contact comparisons. Here are a few key references supporting this work. Thank you very much for listening. We look forward to our further discussion and your valuable feedback. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much, Mary. Now we are going to move to Dave Gordon on his presentation called Improving the Measurement of the Mix of Social and Material Deprivation for Children and Their Families.
Thank you for coming this morning. I'm glad to see you all. I'm going to talk to you this morning about the work we have done to develop a new question module which will hopefully be used in the mix and similar surveys to improve the measurement of poverty for children and their families. So I'm going to tell you why I think this is necessary, what we did to develop the module, and then show you the proposed module. And I've only got 15 minutes to do it in, so I'm afraid I'm going to skip over a lot of the technical details, but I'm happy to answer the questions about them. I also, although all the mistakes are my own, a lot of people have helped in this work, and I haven't got time to name them all, but many of you are in the room and you know who you are. Okay, so SDG 1 target is to there to be no poverty anywhere and to leave no children behind, no people behind, and target 1.2 is to reduce at least by half. I'm going to minimise this. Half the proportion of men, women and children of all ages living in poverty. This is the first time there has been an international agreement that specifically mentions that we should reduce the poverty of children specifically. Previous agreements have been about households. Children were not mentioned. One of the reasons for these international agreements to mention children was that in 2006, the United Nations General Assembly adopted its first ever definition of child poverty, which is here. Children living in poverty are derived of nutrition, water, sanitation, etc. I'm sure many of you already know this. The reason the UN adopted this definition was because of the work of UNICEF and its partners. In the original Millennium Development Goals in 2000, UNICEF and its colleagues wanted children included, but there simply had not been enough work done for it to be included in the Millennium Development Goals. So UNICEF set out to change that situation, to do enough work around the world so that when the SDGs came along in 2015, children were higher up, child poverty was higher up in gender. So in 2008 and 2000 to 2011, UNICEF conducted the first ever global study on child poverty and disparities, And this is results from a Google Ngram viewer of the mention of the phrase child poverty measurement in all books in English language between 1995 and 2015. Before 1995, the first World Social Summit, it's indistinguishable the number of times this phrase is used from the baseline. So the World Social Summit, which gave the first ever internationally agreed definition of child poverty, led to an increase, but it was this global study which resulted in a massive increase and a massive amount of work done on child poverty measurement. And UNICEF and Save the Children, through the Global Coalition and its partners, are responsible for this massive increase and the fact that child poverty has gone up the agenda and appeared in the poverty reduction strategy plans of countries. So, as part of that work, we worked with UNICEF 25 years ago to develop a measure of multidimensional poverty using all the indicators that are in the definition. The reason this definition was appropriate is it comes from the world's first social summit definition of absolute child poverty, and that definition is effectively identical to the minimum core obligation of human rights. So it's compatible with human rights agenda, it's compatible with international measures. The purpose of this work that we did on measuring the 8 dimensions of multidimensional child poverty was as mainly an advocacy tool to raise child poverty up the agenda. It was never meant to be the most rigorous academic study, and it was meant to measure the most severe poverty of children in the poorest countries, not necessarily the best measure of poverty in middle-income countries, and certainly not the best measure of poverty in high-income countries. Now, there's been many developments on the work we did 25 years ago. UNICEF Research Centre for Research in Ashanti have developed the MODA measurement. Our colleagues at Oxford have developed the OPMPI. All these 3 different multidimensional measures use similar indicators. They aggregate them in different ways, but the indicators are more or less identical, give or take. The problem is that the indicators used were never ever designed for measuring child poverty. They are all designed for measuring some other particular target. And unsurprisingly, they don't measure child poverty in the best possible way. They contain a lot of measurement error when you aggregate them, both random error and systematic error. So, let me show you an example. This is an item response theory model. This is the results for the European Union child deprivation measure used in all 27 member states. I'm not going to go through the details, but a good, reliable and valid model will be a series of relatively S-shaped curves, vertically spread between 0 and 3 standard deviations. So this is a relatively good, robust, reliable and valid measure. This is what the multidimensional, this is the MPI for Thailand. You can see the difference. I'm happy to answer more questions about IRT modelling, but just look at the difference. Yep. This is what you're aiming for, this is what you've got with current indicators. Yep. Because the word reliability and validity have a specific statistical meaning, they don't always translate the same way into different languages. When I talk about reliability, I mean the amount of random error of measurement, and when I talk about validity, I mean the amount of bias or systematic error. I don't mean a person is reliable and trustworthy, I mean something about statistical measurement. Okay, so when setting a poverty line and measuring poverty, we believe that you need to go beyond income and look at deprivation. You need to reflect the experiences of the poor. We need to reflect the society in which that measure applies. We need to have age-appropriate and related standards. There needs to be a clear justification of why these indicators have been chosen rather than some other set of indicators. The measure needs to be applicable in low, middle and high income countries if you want to compare countries. And you need to be that enables in that international comparison. We believe the best way to do this is to use the concept of socially perceived necessities. These define the minimum acceptable way of life in any particular society by identifying what the population think are the necessities or essentials in life. These are identified by the public rather than by experts per se. Most poverty measures are developed by experts, whereas people with PhDs may not be the best people to judge what the poor need. Maybe the poor themselves are a better judge of that. It uses representative survey items which the majority think are essential and which people should be able to afford and should not have to do without. These are classed as necessities. So if the majority of people in your society think that children should have this, 3 meals a day or somewhere to do their homework, and the reason those children don't have it is because their parents can't afford it, that's classed as a deprivation. Yeah? The idea is to find a consensus between different groups. Okay, so how do we go about doing comparable and meaningful measures? Well, what we've done to try and develop this measurement module is that we did an expert review amongst poverty researchers. We then did empirical analyses of existing surveys in high, middle and low income countries. We're developing a question module to pilot in the mixed plus surveys, and we'll eventually disseminate all the data once it's been validated. So the problem is that we need it is possible to produce comparable and meaningful poverty measures in all countries given the huge differences in those countries. So in Luxembourg, a poor person may be someone who cannot afford to have the internet for their children, whereas in Liberia it may be someone who can't afford soap and basic necessities. So a prerequisite of being able to measure poverty comparably and in relation to their society is you need a theory which is universal, works in all societies and all points in history. You need a method which automatically adapts your measures to the reality of their lives in that country. We need a measure which produces comparable results even if you're using slightly different questions. And you need to be able to demonstrate that it produces reliable and valid poverty measurements with low error. So, the theory which we believe is applicable in all societies is Townsend's theory of poverty as relative deprivation. Mary's just discussed what that is. Basically, we believe this theory is applicable in all societies at all points in history, and it's also falsifiable and verifiable. The way we develop using socially perceived necessity as a method which adapts to the reality of people's lives is we ask a question, is a set of items necessary, yes or no? Do you have it, yes or no? And if you don't have it, it's because you can't afford it, or if it's a service, because it's not available. And you're only defined as deprived if the majority in your society believe it's a necessity of life, and the reason you don't have that item is because you can't afford it or because the service is not available. And it's very simple to implement. This is an example from Pakistan administered Kashmir. You ask people, do you have, is it necessary, yes, no, do you have it, yes, no, and is it because you can't afford it or don't want it? And you can do this on telephone and face-to-face or many modes of delivery. What we find when we look at the results from empirical research in different countries is here we've used the UK, which is a rich European country, Tonga, which is a middle-income country in the South Pacific, and Uganda, a low-income country in Africa, very diverse societies. We find a lot of agreement. These are the percentage of parents that say these are necessities for children. So for 3 meals a day, it's 93% of parents in the UK, 98% in Tonga, 96% in Uganda. You tend to get quite a lot of agreement on what's the necessities for children across very diverse societies. You can produce comparable estimates using what's called a reflective measurement model because This has a lot of useful properties. The indicators are substitutable. I can happily go into the details of how that works. The method which produced demonstrable, reliable and accurate and precise poverty measures, basically using socially perceived necessities. You don't have to do any complex work to see the difference in these societies. In Uganda, 48% of children don't get 3 meals a day. In Tonga, it's 8%. In the UK, scandalously, it's 1%. This is just the raw percentages. You can see the differences in these societies using these items which the overwhelming majority believe all children should have. Okay, so we can test the reliability and validity of these indicators using suitability measures, validity measures, reliability measures and additivity measures. This is the process that the European Union has adopted for its poverty measurement. It's been discussed by the UN Expert Group on Poverty Statistics, the European Conference of Statisticians, the UNECE, and the Pacific Statistics Forum, and approved as a good method for developing reliable and valid poverty measures. I'm not going to go through that. So here are the ones that we have, questions that we have selected because they've been shown to produce reliable and valid poverty measures in high, middle and low income countries and also been approved by expert review. So this is the household question, which includes visits to health facilities, regular savings, enough money to replace broken items, electronic or worn out furniture, beds and bedding for everyone in the household, a holiday, etc. Some of them are more appropriate to higher middle income countries, some are more appropriate to low income countries. You don't have to have identical questions. As long as you have a core set of questions, you can scale, equate and measure poverty in the same way you do in Luxembourg and Liberia. This is the adult questions, meat, fish and vegetarian equivalent, fresh fruits and vegetables, 2 pairs of shoes, clothing sufficient to keep warm and dry. These questions are thought of as necessities in all countries in the world. And last but not least, the child deprivation questions. Again, these questions are thought of in all the necessities in all the countries in the world in which they've been tested and been shown statistically to be reliable and valid. Thank you very much.
Next session will be on social protection, child poverty and resilience. Olivier Fiala.
Good morning, everyone. So I want to show a couple of things, a couple of slides I put together on social protection, on the social protection module in MIX, which appeared newly in the MIX 6 round and is now being refined. So just to motivate maybe the conversation, I think you're all aware, and I don't need to go too much into detail, as social protection being both a universal right, but also a really powerful tool to reduce poverty. It's a crucial foundation for children to develop, to fulfill their potential, and specifically, obviously, in communities struggling with different vulnerabilities. And there are, and I will come to specifically climate, but there are a lot of conversations around adaptive social protection contexts, where they need to adapt to changing circumstances. And what I show you in the next few slides is very much a descriptive analysis, no fancy kind of statistics, but just an overview across the countries we have data for what we find alongside a few key questions. And the objective is very much to better understand social protection coverage among children, the challenges that appear from that, and also I think the basis for future analysis and discussions. So specifically, I looked at 3 research questions to narrow it down a bit. The first one is to look at the coverage among children, so basically just, like what does the data show? We know obviously that child poverty, social protection is really helpful to combat child poverty. So I was really keen to link those two for countries where we can do that using multidimensional child poverty and seeing a little bit like who's benefiting from social protection. But also I did a quick analysis more on the wealth-based kind of comparison. So second question, who is benefiting from it? And the third one is if we know it links to, or it's a tool to combat the negative effects of climate shocks or other shocks, how well do current social protection programs align, at least geographically, with different risks? So that's kind of a quick insight on the third one. For all of the three questions, as I was saying, we looked at the social protection module in MIX. The questionnaire includes question on the knowledge and the receipt of specific social transfers or benefits. So if you have worked with that particular data, they're usually like 3 to 5 specific programs. And then there are some kind of catchment programs like any retirement pension or any other assistant. Then there are specific questions about school tuition and school-related support for those for household members 5 to 24. And there are the questions about health insurance, Sarah, you presented already. So those are complementary topics. That means like they don't necessarily appear in every survey if they're not being picked up by countries. But we have a pretty good coverage, I think. There are quite a few limitations at the moment, and I know they're being addressed in round 7, which is fantastic. So at the moment, it's a household level measure. Like, did the household receive anything? You don't necessarily know who in the household received a specific program. And there is also at the moment a lack of adequacy, right? We don't necessarily know how much we're talking about or if that support is in any way like big enough to combat any negative effects. So bringing the data together, we pooled 36 mixed surveys, 1 million children roughly. They're all round 6, so between 2017 and 2023, and you see a bit. Oh, on my screen I see at least the rest of the world. You see only like there should be a gray shade for the rest of the world, but you can guess your way through. You see there are 6 low-income countries, 15 lower middle-income countries, 15 upper middle-income countries. So I'm using a little bit the income categories in the next few slides, but not suggesting that those 6 countries are representative for low-income countries. It's just like to group them, right, to give it a bit more nuance. But just, important as a takeaway that I'm not talking about representative information for different income groups. So on the first question, so across our sample, we find like 41% of children living in a household which received any social assistance in the last 3 months. So again, we don't necessarily look in detail at this stage what kind of social assistance it is, beyond the breakdown I come to in a second. But we see like that roughly 40%, 4 out of 10 children do live in a household which receives any support. You can see on the right-hand side that this varies dramatically between countries, and obviously within countries. We will see more of that in a second. And a lot of the transfers are school-related support. So I broke it a bit down in the graph in the bottom left corner, but you can see the blue bar is a household receiving any transfers. The red one are specific social benefit programs, like where the specific program was indicated, and the green one are school-related support. So you can see, especially in low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, school-related supports are actually a really big part of that story. That was the slide I added this morning because I spoke to Tom last night, and I was mentioning to him that it would be really worth, I think an exercise worth doing, comparing it to existing social protection measures and estimates. ILO, for example, presents. So there's the indicator 131 in the SEG framework, which looks at effective coverage. It looks at like coverage which are legally kind of available, right? There are already, by definition, some differences to the mixed module, so they won't be identical, but it will be interesting to see the differences, right? Like, I put the scatter plot down there, and you see on the horizontal axis the mixed measure, and on the vertical axis the ILO measure. You would expect maybe a little bit more of a trend between countries where ILO says there are a lot of children receive, so that is the whole household from ILO, but they have a child-specific one. But you would think there is a bit more of a trend between where ILO says households or children receive social benefit programs versus where mix indicates they are actually receiving social benefit programs. And I think that would be a really nice things to look into it. I draw some of the data from the Child Atlas. I thought, given how much work I spent on that, I wanted to share that. But I think that's generally an interesting kind of comparison worth making. And also, conversation worth having with ILO about how to measure social protection in different situations. So coming to the second question, who is benefiting? So we're just breaking it a bit down by the different characteristics. So 44% of children in rural areas receiving it versus 34% in urban areas. You see in that really complex chart on the right-hand side, there are a lot of subnational differences. So the small yellow line you see is the national average, and then there are a darker purple one for urban, a lighter purple one for rural, and then there are darker red and lighter red for the region with the highest and the subnational or the admin 1 level, whatever the definition is in each country, with the highest and the lowest coverage. And you see a lot of differences between, obviously, different regions. And on the chart at the bottom left is kind of the attempt to summarize that. And you see there are some differences between rural and urban across the different countries, and there are big differences between regions. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be a problem, right? That can be just a sign of very good targeting, because those regions are regions which have maybe a lot of deprivations. So that is still an open question, but I think it's still interesting seeing those kind of difference between different regions. And we come back to that kind of targeting question. If you look from a wealth perspective, and again, I'm using the asset-based wealth index here to indicate the different wealth groups, with all the caveats that comparing that across countries, is a tiny bit tricky. But you can see that poorer households are generally more likely to receive social assistance than richer households. But we do find actually across the different income groups, you find like the highest bar in the second quintile, interestingly enough, not necessarily in the poorest quintile. And this is also reflected a little bit in those kind of Lorentz curves. If you look across those different ones, so you see they are progressive in, based on that definition in all three country contexts, but you do see slight differences, and especially at the beginning of the distribution, it's quite close to the dashed line. And then we try to do that step I mentioned earlier. We try to link that with poverty measures we have. So there are 16 countries where we have an overlap at the moment of, we have a globally comparable estimate of child poverty. We do have the social protection module, and we're basically bringing those information together on an individual level. And you see, interestingly enough, there is mostly a negative correlation between those two, both when you look at prevalence as well as when you look at depth of poverty. Now, so you see those is overall negative, and it's negative in low income and in lower middle income countries. Only in upper middle income countries it's positive correlation. Now, we need to figure out a bit more what that means. Like, either that is a lack of targeting. You are kind of not really reaching those who are having the biggest needs. Like the correlation is, as it shows, is negative, or it's a success of the program. Those who were really needy in the past received social protection program, and therefore nowadays when we measure it in our cross-sectional analysis, are suddenly having a positive, having that kind of negative correlation, right? So that's a bit like an open question for research, but I still kind of expected, I think, a little bit more of a stronger correlation between those two. And that's on the, just to say, that was on the individual child level, right? Not on a national level. And finally, coming to the third question, and that was something we started exploring a little bit, and Will shared yesterday the report cover already. We had that report with the Global Coalition to End Child Poverty on climate and child poverty, with a strong focus on social protection as one way to build those kind of adaptive systems. And for the report, I started with something similar, like this graph here, just purely on a subnational level, combining social protection estimates for mix with climate risk. So we're using for climate risk some climate model data we have developed with the University of Brussels at Save the Children, but it probably looks quite similar if you use other climate measures, and it might be worth exploring that. But for those kind of 31 countries, so each of those bubbles you see here is one subnational region. The size of it is the child population in that region. And you see basically a kind of flat line. So you don't really see any strong correlations between climate effectiveness, how much children experience climate risks or expected to experience climate risk versus kind of social protection coverage. So in short, like families or children living in those high-risk communities are not more likely to be covered than children who are not living in those high-risk communities. What we didn't do in the report, but what I thought was really interesting, is breaking that a bit down by different kind of risks. And again, and there was a similar story we had in the report on child poverty and climate more broadly. It kind of has there are certainly a lot of different stories emerging once you're looking at different types of disasters. So we don't really find anything for wildfires, but you see a positive and significant correlation for crop failures, for floods, and for cyclones. And you have this negative relationship, which is also significant for heat waves and droughts. Right? So there are some disasters where they seem to, if you're experiencing crop failures more often, you're more likely to be covered by social protection programs. But then there are droughts or heat waves where it's actually the opposite, which is, again, quite interesting on the global level, a bit hard to action, but certainly create or ask some interesting questions. So I leave it here just to say, obviously, it's such a crucial tool to look at social protection coverage when we look at poverty, and having that in the mix is great, and it's nice to, and we just talked about that, it's nice to have address some of those shortcomings the current module have. But I think it's really valuable to link social protection to different sectoral outcomes. We saw that for health insurance specifically, but I think it would be really nice to link it to education outcomes, to different health outcomes, child protection issues. And obviously having those kind of geospatial links. And I was thinking about doing that analysis I was showing you on the previous slide. For those countries we have geospatial data, we could actually do much more granular links between social protection and climate link. So I think there's a lot of potential opening up with the geospatial side, with the social protection side, which we didn't have a few years ago. So that's really great. And yeah, I think much more thinking needed both on the distributional effects, but also on the link to climate risk specifically, right? Because it's so much seen as a crucial tool for adaptive social protection when you talk about climate, but at the moment it doesn't seem to be really strongly correlated. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
In the next session, I'm going to introduce Alexander Hunt, right, for estimating monetary poverty among the Roma community in Serbia, relating the household budget survey and mix.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm very happy to stay very quiet in the back and get away with it, but all right, I came all the way here, so let's get on with it. This, I mean, it's a set of cosmic jokes, because I also feel that now, having listened to your excellent presentation, we're going to look tone deaf, utterly deaf, at what we've tried to do in this presentation, as though we've gone back 20 years to try and do what we were really trying to do at the turn of the millennium by trying to build this, sort of the Martin Ravallian-esque data landscape. And we're still finding this wasn't in 2024, this was a few years ago, that there are massive gaps in this data landscape. And this is speaking a little bit to what Liliana spoke very cogently on yesterday, in the challenges of using mix and national data sets, and that there is still so much disharmony, even, really 25 years after this revolution started. And this is absolutely not revolutionary. This is the most blunt force approach that you could possibly think to take. But we're going to talk about a challenge we had to overcome for a project we did with UNICEF in Serbia a few years ago now. Serbia, for those of you unfamiliar with this rather intriguing country to the east, went through a period, as did many of the countries in that region, a period of economic liberalization and transition. It suffered from some rather lamentable industrial decline under the Washington Consensus, inflation and unemployment, though this has rather turned around with relatively good economic growth and improvements in unemployment for, let's say, most of its population. The changes to lives and livelihood that we all experienced during COVID-19 were, of course, still present in Serbia, though a rather prompt and laudable effort by the government led to relatively rapid economic rebound in a number of Serbia's key sectors. The they say something about picking your neighbours carefully, and I'm not sure Serbia picked its neighbours particularly carefully, because the conflict in Ukraine, the illegal invasion of Ukraine in 2022, did quite a lot to undermine Serbia's post-COVID-19 economic recovery. It is quite limited. I'm sure you're all experts on Serbia's economic and energy interrelation in the region, so I'll save you that, but it is quite dependent on its friends and neighbours for things like energy, food and trade, given its geographic position. This led to really rather rapid inflation. It was, in fact, quite terrifying to see it during our in-country missions, with food and energy prices eroding purchasing power, of course, globally, but as well as in Serbia. And while absolute poverty reduced between 2017 and 2020, and with an accompanying decrease in the rate of at-risk poverty, inequality remained really rather stubbornly high. And I was part of a team, my far more notable colleagues here on the screen, and I were part of a team challenged by UNICEF Serbia to create estimates of the potential effects of the joint shocks of COVID-19 and the conflict in Ukraine on poverty and consumption in Serbia. But for those of you who are relatively familiar with the region, Serbia is also home to one of Europe's largest marginalized communities, the Roma community. This is a community, not one heterogeneous community, but they often share the same name, that's found all across from Romania all the way to Ireland. But Serbia has a particularly large population. And this is a highly marginalized or normatively at-risk group that is often excluded from analysis, even analysis done in countries like Serbia due to data blind spots. So as part of our task here, we were also to try and find a way to include the Roma population in our analysis. So, I mean, as we said, it is Europe's largest ethnic minority, and it faces discrimination, it faces marginalization across Europe, and unfortunately including in Serbia. And we can see here, this is some data drawn from UNICEF statistics. We can really see that the Roma population have a much higher rate of the population than the national Serbian population with respect to material deprivations, with rates of limited access to sanitation, stunting in children, and really rather poor attendance of, in fact, both early childhood education and secondary education. So this is a problem that UNICEF Serbia is really trying to emphasize and to draw out, but of course there is quite a large data gap. Serbia, the National Statistical Office of Serbia, fields household surveys, as household budget surveys, like in common with many countries, but the data it's not even, I think I wrote it rather cautiously here. It's not just that it's not really nationally representative or representative in this national survey, that it's not really included at all to our knowledge. We've been informed that the enumeration areas deliberately exclude these communities, so we had to find a solution. So to be able to assess monetary poverty in this community, we needed to find a way to take the results of our household budget survey, which contains our income and consumption variables, as household budget surveys are wont to do, and apply it to UNICEF Serbia's Roma Mix module. So they have a specific module that's fielded among these communities and is representative of this community. But unfortunately, it doesn't contain key variables like consumption, expenditure in any form, income in any form. So we were left with a bit of a challenge. And we're incredibly aware of that our position, neither as Serbian nor as Roma, that we are fitting a model of poverty onto people who culturally may not recognize this definition of poverty. And I mean, the results we presented before, the material deprivations, speak to themselves, but the task was, of course, to find a way to fit a model of monetary poverty onto these households, irrespective of whether that is a culturally defined and understood measure of their deprivation. So without the measure of consumption in this data set, we needed a way to fit this result on. There are really two ways that we thought of being able to do this. We were, at the time, working with policymakers in Serbia, groups of economists and policymakers. So it needed to be a heuristically understandable and easily implemented model. So we came up with a sort of matching method between the two data sets based on assets. And now latterly, and this is what we're here to explore, what we can do a little bit more about, we looked at a regression-based approach, which is kind of similar to small area estimates that are used in the census analysis of poverty, for example. So we can probably skip this for the sake of time, but we're working with the 2022 mix and the 2021 household budget survey. They're not exactly contemporaneous, but near enough. So our initial method was to find a set of assets in common, and already the challenge of finding assets and variable in common between the data sets was harder than we think it possibly ought to have been. But we found this common set of assets. We used the assets in each of the data sets to generate some kind of asset score. And then between the data sets, we used a process that pretty closely resembles propensity score matching. It's just a nearest neighbor match. We found that gave better results than some of the other common matching methods available to link our standardized scores between the data sets. Of course, you will understand that there were some differences, so we used a standardized score. And then, based on this score, we were able to... I can speed up. Based on this score, we were able to find a proxy in the larger household budget survey data set. From there, we had relatively detailed consumption data, and we were even able to explore the possibility of using income data that was kindly provided by the Statistical Office, but there are all sorts of risks of using income data that we're all quite familiar with. And so based on this matching score, we were able to generate our poverty estimates. This approach it's relatively simple. We skipped over some of the technical details, but it really met the brief of being easily implementable by policymakers in Serbia. But the critical assumption is, of course, this is a relatively blunt force tool of using simply assets. We have to assume that assets are linked with consumption consistently between communities and in a community. That relationship, it's not alien. Asset indices are used quite commonly in analysis of this type. But the strong cultural differences between the two communities that we're trying to relate here may render this assumption unsound or unsafe. But what we would say is that our poverty estimate is in line with OECD estimates. That's OSCO estimates were in line with that. And we do find that if we match with, for example, proportion of people within Serbia receiving this base level social assistance, that we are approximately in line, though what we would really like to do is some validation exercises by matching qualitative data with our quantitative findings. So you can see that we estimate rather a high absolute poverty headcount rate, nearly 74% for the overall population, with some evidence that female-headed households are at greater risk, along with aged-headed households, or only one parent alive-headed households, for example. We should take these disaggregations with a slight pinch of salt because the survey is very small, and the weighting, the weights available to us, we have some concerns about whether they're usable, which we're still exploring with UNICEF Serbia. Very quickly, we also wanted to look at whether we can take methods that are used for small area estimates, where we go from a detailed household survey to the census, which has greater representation of small areas, which in a sense we're talking about, smaller areas really dominated by Roma populations, which uses a set of regression approaches. There are multiple different options available. For example, and I can't pronounce his name properly, so I will call it the ELL method, to fit these unit level models, and then we extrapolate then down, except instead of going up to the census, we go down to our very small survey. So this is something we're still exploring, so that the basic principle is to fit a model in this nearly contemporaneous household survey, obtain the coefficients, and predict in our small area, which could be thought of as a small area of a census. But instead of a geographic area, we look at a subgroup. So in the Household Budget Survey of 2021, we fitted a nested error linear model, and we used adjusted per capita consumption against this matrix, a variable common to both data sets. And this common to both data sets part is doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. This was really quite a challenge to find comparably phrased data sets. My Serbian is a little bit rusty as well, so we're a little unsure on some of the translations here and there. And using the results, the welfare is simulated in our Roma mix survey using the coefficients. I would love to be able to present the table of results, but A, I don't have any time, which I could have got away with, and B, it's on a laptop that has died unexpectedly on me, so we're a little bit stuck on that. So I will finish with our assumption, or the assumptions and limitations. Of course, we are assuming that the residuals are normally distributed, conditional on our characteristics, and that the variation in welfare is only the result of our variation in unobserved, observed household characteristics, and our location-specific effects. So the regions, the 4 high regions in Serbia. And there are, of course, as you will know much more cogently than I, there are challenges with efficiency and finding an efficient estimator with the extremely limited data at hand. And we're very keen, as perhaps sitting on the other side from some of you, as independent evaluators of UN projects and programs, to see how we can work to make mix a greater part of the evaluation, the independent evaluation landscape, which we sometimes struggle with a little bit now. So really to wrap up, the poverty estimates of marginalised or normatively at-risk communities have been difficult, and this is not just true of the Roma in Serbia. We are trying to use 2 different and slightly competing methods, but we find that our key, it's not a recommendation, but it's a conclusion here, that even in relatively prosperous European countries, the data landscape to do what we've really been trying to set out to do since this the post-millennium framework was set out is still relatively difficult to do. And so doing the incredible work that Dave Gordon's doing is but a pipe dream when we can't even get over this first hurdle. So thank you very much for this unexpected presentation for you all. I'm aware I'm standing between you. I could see in your eyes that coffee break was so close, and I've moved you so far away from this. Nevertheless, thank you very much for the invitation, for having us, and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. You still finish even 15 seconds in advance. So are there any questions? Okay, Tatiana. Sorry, she won over you.
Hi, thank you. It's more of a comments and maybe a little bit explanations. I need to say that actually I'm from there. So, and I was conducting Roma surveys. So yeah, we need to talk. The thing is that in general in the region, we have mixed surveys for Roma population. It's not part of national mix, it's separate survey. So each round, in last 3 rounds, 4 rounds, I don't even remember, we have literally 2 surveys for in Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, all those countries. So this is basically nationally representative survey. It's done because of these reasons that you already mentioned, because they are, like when we look national population, they are very small percentage. So if we look at the national surveys, even if we manage to catch some of them, there is no disaggregation, data are not representative, and so on. So this is one important thing that, we should all be aware. I remember in Mix 5 that we were, because it's not possible to compare, let's say, the poorest population from national mix and poorest population from Roma mix. So I remember we were doing some calculations, and we came up with a figure that 83% of all Roma population would actually be in the poorest national quintile, which is really saying a lot. So this is one of the things I would advise you to go and look, if you didn't do it, to check silk surveys in Serbia. It's, you know about EU silk. Okay, yeah. because they are also, at least I was not there for a few years now, but I remember previously they were able, at least unofficially in statistical office, they were able to pull some useful data about income and expenditure for Roma population. So yeah, we can talk later. I don't want to take their time. Yeah.
We can say it's great that. It's great to have someone from Serbia here to comment on it, and actually we're quite grateful to the UNICEF team, because without the, and yes, perhaps I used the language of like a separate pull-out survey a little bit loosely, but this survey fielded specifically among the Roma is absolutely essential. I mean, without it, we would have absolutely no information at all, and this is great. It's more a frustration that after all of this time, there's still this inability to exactly transpose the results, so to ensure there's a consistent approach, because mix needs to be consistent within mix. Household budget surveys need to be consistent within their own operating legislative frameworks, but this creates disharmony. It's interesting as well, you say Montenegro. We also did a similar project in Montenegro and ran up against the same thing. I don't want to spoil the next paper we're going to write, but you know, look forward to volume 2. So it's rather a perhaps it came over too negative. Gratitude, excellent survey. Annoyance because we're still facing this this little speed bump here. And yes, you're right. We absolutely would not question at all if you said that the conception of poverty, the differences in the community, the understanding and interpretation, exactly as Dave Gordon said, of these culturally relevant markers of deprivation are going to be completely different between these two universes that exist in a relatively small country, which is both fascinating and challenging. And I wish I hadn't had to go after Dave's presentation, because it looks like we're absolutely blind to what he's saying. But and I'm sure he'll beat us up in the coffee break later. But this is something we can only, I think, enrich with exactly as this presentation suggests, with perhaps complementing the qualitative analysis, which is something we'd love to go back and do with our colleagues in UNICEF Serbia, because this is probably the only way we can begin to understand this. So thank you for the comment. I think you had another one which I forgot. Oh, silk, yes, that's true.
It shows a different area. It's just
Thank you.
good luck for you with that. No, it's really
Thank you. So let's move to the next question. Who's second? Oh, now I don't know how to decide. You all raised at the same time. Should I start again? All right. Quick question. I'll take only questions, no more long comments, because we have 5 minutes left.
No, exactly. It's 2 questions that makes 3 presenters, presenter number 1, presenter number 2, and number 4. The first one is, yesterday we saw the presentation about Pakistan and all the effort they are doing to compile different regional surveys into one country survey. But in this presentation, we see aggregates without fear. You know, a cluster with all the mix at the same time to compare. What are the concerns that we need to have temporarily, because those surveys are at different times? How fair is to do that exercise? The second one is a topic about the different levels of the questionnaire, and it was reflected in the first presentation. However, it was also implied in the fourth presentation. And I quote the claim: children with disabilities are less likely to be covered. You know, while the semantic is true, when you do the statistic, the pragmatic might not be. Because it doesn't mean that, oh, you have disabilities, then we will not cover you. Is that coincidentally, a household that says no coverage has children with disability. How can we go to a causal study? Is because they have disability that the insurance are saying we don't cover? Is that the insurance for someone with disability is more costly, so they are not included? So, because at the moment I don't see the logical connection between the statistics and the claim that is we are not covering them because of that level.
Okay, so I'll let you react after.
So I have a long comment. No, just kidding. No, a quick question for Dave. Really interesting presentation. I was just curious about your thoughts on the use of these new methods to replicate multidimensional poverty using, for example, satellite data. And 2 questions about it. One is what do you think about it? Because from a theoretical perspective, I don't know how much we can grasp about multidimensional poverty from photos from above. But the second one, understanding that these are already imperfect measures, but like our best proxies for it. What are your thoughts on us trying to replicate something that might not be perfect? We might be picking into something that might be misleading to some extent. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Sorry, William.
Thank you. I think the first question is for Sara, and thank you so much for the presentation. I would like to know whether you explored the type of disability and the coverage of health insurance. This is maybe something that could contribute as well to the results that you find. And since it's Dave Gordon, I allow myself to ask some tough questions. The model, I don't know where you stand with the implementation of this model. I think Attila and Enrique will tell us whether it's going to be implemented yet, or soon, or no, or where you stand on that. I'm really curious to know the status. But I see already some limitations, right? It's going to be perception-based. It's like whether you see this as a necessity for me or no. I don't know whether on the process of the validation of the questionnaire, whether you came up with some results showing that even during or within one society, there are a lot of divergence, I mean, in terms of whether you see this as a necessity for me or no. So how are you going to do that? I understand that at later stages of the implementation as well, we need to be careful on how we're going to implement this. Putting this in a phone survey is not going to be the same as putting this in the face-to-face survey. So is this something maybe related to the sample design and all of that? All right. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I will let Sara answer very quickly to all the many questions.
Thank you. So the first question was about pooling methods. And so for that, similar to what we heard in Pakistan yesterday, is we've used a meta-analysis method rather than a population standardization method. And so we found that has been the best way to pool mixed data across all of our analyses. The second question was about coverage of children with disabilities, and I think that that's an important thing. This is much more descriptive, not saying that the disability is causing them not to be covered, but it could be various factors. So a child's disability might mean that a parent is less likely to participate in the labor force, which is how they would incur insurance. And so definitely can be teased out, but it was much more descriptive to say this is just another level of social inequity for children with disabilities rather than something causal. And then no, we haven't looked at the type of impairment with the set of Washington groups included in the mixed survey. Seeing, hearing, walking are fairly straightforward domains. The others are more difficult to categorize nicely into impairment groups, but definitely something we can look at and are interested in exploring. Thanks.
And now, Oliver.
Yeah, I can keep it really short. Really helpful on the pooling one, and we can discuss a bit more. I guess it's also for our purpose. It very much like to look at the link. We rely on the latest available data. So there is certainly a time element there, and 5 years earlier, social protection coverage might have been lower than 5 years later. To be honest, some of the climate information from the global climate models, they're looking at 20 years averages, right? So looking at those links, I'm not sure if it changes the story dramatically, but I completely appreciate the point, which I think would be really interesting with the UNICEF colleagues, HQ colleagues to explore, because I believe for global averages, we still do the similar thing, right? We're looking at like 2015 to 2020. That's the time frame for having a global estimate on like child marriage or child poverty and stuff like that. So I think that is an interesting question, how valid that is. But I completely take it. I think it's really fair.
Thank you, Oliver. Before I give it to Dave, because there is a very important question online, I will take the question so that you can answer all of the questions, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, right? Should I do that?
That's right. So there are a few questions online, but there is one specifically that Dave wants to answer, and it relates to one of the indicators in terms of holiday trips.
So I'll answer the questions in the room first. People always perceive that if you're doing it based on opinion, there'll be a massive range of opinion within a country. What we've found, and the empirical analyses I've just shown you, is based on analyses from 43 countries in high, middle and low income societies, that if there is a homogeneity, a consensus across societies, obviously there are differences, but if you know what men think, you tend to know what women think. If you know what rich people think, you tend to know what poor people think. If you know what one ethnic group thinks, you tend to know what another ethnic group thinks. You can produce hundreds of the most boring graphs in the world showing that you can predict one from the other. People never believe that, but that's what the results show time and time again. So to give you an example, in the European Union, there are 27 countries, 40 legislatures, I don't know how many different languages are spoken, I think it's about 50, and multiple ethnic groups. Not only is there a homogeneity across countries, so there are obviously differences in the score but within the country, but you can show there's measurement in variance with the deprivation score that you derive. So a score of 2 in Germany and a score of 2 in Bulgaria mean the same level of poverty. Yeah? So we can show that methodologically. And the reason for this is that asking people what they think are the necessities of life gives a high face validity to the answers. It's what the population believe are important. So someone asked online, why should policymakers care about if people can't afford to go on holiday with their children? Policymakers tend to care about physical needs of people. Yeah? So whether children are immunised, whether they go to school. The population cares about other things. They don't care just about their physical needs, which we all have, food, water, clothing. They also care about their social obligations and their social needs. All societies, all human societies, have a core set of social needs which our society requires us to fulfill, to give presents at certain times of year, to mark certain life events, deaths, births, coming of age. In no human society, when your parents died, you just walk away and leave the body. Yeah. So these are really important, and people will often go without their material needs in order to meet their social obligations. Going on holiday is considered to be important in many countries where it's been asked by both parents, and in the countries where we've asked children, by the children themselves. And it becomes a reliable measure as part of a latent variable of deprivation, which reduces the amount of error when you're trying to measure poverty. Expert-led poverty measures, say, let's take the World Bank $1 a day. Experts say you need this amount of calories. They see the food that people buy. They assume everyone cooks the same way and eats all the food. There's no wastage. They then assume that the people who meet their calorie requirements, whatever work they're doing, also meet their non-food requirements, and so they then guess that the poverty line based on how much it costs to buy that food times however much it costs those people who meet their food requirements to meet their non-food requirements. The error on that is about 50 or 60%. So we know that 20% of the population in a country is below the $1 a day or $2.15 a day, plus or minus 50%. Yeah? That is not a good way of making policy. Yeah? If you want to make policy, you need to know that your anti-poverty policies are working. You need to be able to monitor. You need to know what's important to people and what's important to children. And it's a fundamental part of the rights of a child that you should consult people in the measurement of poverty. It should be socially realistic. The trouble is, in many countries, you have poverty lines which basically bear no relationship to what the population actually needs. So statistical offices churn these poverty lines out, and everyone, including the politicians, ignores them. That's just a complete waste of money. It's better to have a poverty line, even if it's politically difficult, which actually means something, that shows you what the population want. So that's what this is aimed to do. And it improves the measurement of poverty. It looks not just at people's material needs, but also their social obligations and social needs. And therefore, it fits in with what people actually want. To give you an example, politicians want children to go to school. Parents and children want more than that. They want to learn something. Yeah? Going to school itself is it's nice, but that's not what you're there for.
Thank you, Dave. So now I'm going to let Dr. Delamonica the third.
No, just a couple of things. If I got a footnote maybe, or a further comments to what Dave said about the leisure part, right? Because this comes very, very often when we try to measure poverty, child poverty, and we include things like toys or vacations. People say, oh, no, that's not poverty. But in UNICEF, we have a human rights approach to poverty. And there is a human right, and there is a child right to leisure and cultural activities. So I think it's a fundamental piece that has to be there. That's number one. Number two, and I think Ashraf left. Oh, no, there you go. So we are discussing, we are thinking, we are trying to see if we can implement this, at least in the Mix Plus, in the follow-up questions, but no decisions have been made. And I don't know if Attila or Tatiana want to add anything to that answer. I'm more than happy, but if not, then you.
All right. Thank you so much. I am closing this session.